Hello there. Welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is, of course, the show where we dive into the weird, peculiar world of music out there, right? We find different sorts of albums, just have a chat about them, Maybe introduce you, the viewer, to sort of stuff you maybe haven't heard of before, or, maybe stuff you have heard before, but you just want to hear an opinion about maybe. Who knows? Anyway, in today's episode, we will once again be returning to the UK tape label Steep Gloss for a third descent into the unclassifiable, the abstract, the delirious, and the dislocating. Today, we're talking about an album that I generally don't know how to classify, to be fair. I don't know what this technically comes under as. Maybe it's experimental sound art, maybe it's just abstract Dadaism, who knows. But regardless, it's a really weird, peculiar, yet fascinating album. So today, I present to you the collaborative album, as with all records on Steep Gloss, Waiting in the Waiting Room with a Waiter and a Waitress by Joan La Babbleuh. Okie dokie, another esoteric, abstract and strange sound art exploration utilising sound sources from two collaborators and meshing it together into this very weird, unusual listening experience, right? I think it's brilliant. But of course, let's ask ourselves, who are Joan La Barbara? Well, Joan La Barbara is a collaboration between Italian musician, composer, experimenter Ben Presto and American middle-aged artsy and nice lady Angela Sawyer. And so on one side, we have Ben Presto, an experimenter and improviser who, delves deep into avant-garde and noise, being rather active in Italy in a number of different projects, apparently. And then on the other end, you've got Angela Sawyer, who seems to enjoy being involved in a number of different projects as well, but ranging from, experimental music to even comedy shows, apparently. And so before we dive into this album, a bit more about the artist. So some interesting background information tells us that Presto was involved in a band called Larsen Lombrichi, who started in 1997. And apparently, they combined multimedia projects with public art and urban actionism, which I think sounds incredibly cool. And then Sawyer, on the other hand, is a long-time experimental musician from Boston who used to run a now-defunct store known as Weirdo Record, which is a brilliant name for a store, to be fair. And so, these two worlds combined together, two experimental musicians with very different backgrounds and rather different directions they explored it in. And yet right here, in the palm of our hands, is, a little album from these two sources culminating in this incredibly confusing and very strange yet wonderful listening experience. So, what is Waiting in the Waiting Room with a Waiter and a Waitress, then? Well, it is a very unusual album, comprising of two tracks on the A and the B side. And so opening up the entire suite is the first track of or ER maybe? Who knows? Say it however you want, I guess. And this is such a strange smorgasbord of sound sources all just coming together in this really peculiar yet fascinating way. There's such a sense of freeform expressionism, the composition's just taking us down these really weird yet wonderful avenues, And on this one, at the opening, you've got these little micro sounds opening up the proceedings, accompanied by what I think are peculiar wind instruments, rattling percussions and whistles that, just immediately establish that confusing landscape that we're going to be navigating. And then it all just starts to wander off into these really weird, peculiar places. And listening to this, I'm reminded so much of of the likes of Basil Kirchin, for example, especially in how it traverses from movement to movement, all these different, sound sources coming together and just creating this moving thing that goes from part A to part B to part C, etc., etc. And I'm also reminded of the incredibly experimental nature of the likes of Christophe Mignon, whose experiments with sound from a variety of sources, just culminates in these incredibly weird recordings that are very unusual to listen to, and so much of the weirdness of steep gloss just expresses this to me, I feel. And yet, for all its weirdness, for all its unusual peculiarities, there is something rather engrossing about this whole composition as a whole, though, especially around 7 minutes in, when the unusual soundscapes are accompanied by this rather unusual yet interesting drone, which is then itself accompanied by an incredibly unusual vocal performance. And to me, it does not sound like a human voice. It sounds like air escaping the end of a balloon, I feel. Whether it is that, it could well be that, to be fair. I don't know. It could just perhaps be the sounds of the human voice, stretching and contorting itself into weird and unusual ways. There's no way of telling, to be honest, because there's very little information on this thing, but the mystery of it is very enticing, of course. But yeah, the more this one progresses, though, it's just the weirder it becomes, though, just moving from direction to direction, to landscape, scene to scene, and it's never adhering to its own rules, and instead just exploring such abstract forms of expression, if that makes sense. And so we flip the cassette over, we move on to the second track, Res, which is a roughly 20-minute composition that opens up with, so arguably jazzy-style drums, I would say. But don't be fooled, though, don't be fooled. It doesn't take long for this incredibly weird little sound to start entering the scene, just looping over and over again. Just going, wow, 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 wow. I don't even know what it is. It's like but it sounds brilliant, and it just constantly repeats ad nauseum on this thing. And, becoming accompanied, though, by other odd little sounds, creating this rather tumultuous and confusing scene for us, that becomes very difficult to comprehend indeed. And along that, you're getting these sort of strangled, scratchy acoustic instruments, all the while, though, that peculiar sound, the siren, the alarm, whatever you want to call it, it's just pushing the composition onwards, basically. And this one, it raises such an eyebrow, as it then falls away around 6 minutes in, and then you're just left with this incredibly ominous sounding and echoing drone of what I assume it's some kind of gong, maybe? Or maybe someone imitating it, once again, who knows what the sources of the sounds are on this album? Oh, goodness. It changes the whole scene, and it almost puts you into this stunned state as it guides the composition into this more peculiar scene. And all the while, the rattling and echoing of something, just occupies the forefront of everything. But of course, it's not over yet. This is a very long composition, and it explores a lot of different ideas. And eventually it gets to, one of my favourite parts of both this composition and the album itself. And that's when you get the really peculiar jazzy drum pattern entering the scene again, accompanied by really unusual, almost operatic vocals, drowned in these unusual reverby effects, itself then accompanied by jazzy, almost discordant and atonal piano notes. Or it could be a glockenspiel, who knows? I find there to be something, just very amusing but vastly interesting about this section of the composition, and I find it so absurdly to listen to as a result, even though trying to listen to it just ends up, pulling me into this really dazed stupor where it all just continues to progress, leaving me behind just to comprehend the entire thing. And there's a wonderful end to that one as well, though. You get this incredibly far-reaching soundscape that continues to build up on the confusion and the madness that the whole album has presented to us up to this entire point. And I don't know why, it's so just bizarre and wacky and weird, but there's something brilliant about it. I feel it's so peculiar and interesting. I find, what a peculiar album, but I find it delightful, and especially as well how much this reminds me of Basil Kirchin. which they're not so much in the terms of the actual sounds themselves, but rather in how there's this incredibly free-form abstraction to the sounds, which are all structured in this very unusual yet cohesive fashion as it all progresses along. And it's a smorgasbord of just these unusual and peculiar sources, sourced from both artists, and expressed to us as this experimental album that seems to be, a tribute to a particular artist indeed. And so, basically when doing research, there's a little bit on the back here actually, and I find this kind of interesting, so I'm just going to read this out to you. Recorded in separate locations and mixed together umpteen times, Miss La Babbleuh is not a real person, but Miss La Barbara definitely is. And so I was intrigued by this and did some research, and as a result, I'm pretty sure that this experimental album is a tribute to the wonderful vocalist Joan La Barbara, an experimental composer known for her explorations of non-conventional or extended vocal techniques. And I have to say, I'm so grateful to have discovered Joan La Barbara through this incredibly strange and esoteric album, as La Barbara's work is phenomenal and unusual, and it's one of the best explorations of the capabilities of the human voice that I have ever heard in anything, and as well exploring the vast array of sounds that can just be produced by contorting your voice in unusual ways. And I would assume then, especially given the name of this collaborative project, and to mention La Barbara on the notes as well, that this is referencing her in some way or form and being almost a tribute to her, especially in terms of her contribution to experimental music, if that makes sense. It's hard to say for sure, but with how abstract and freeform this particular album is, it would make sense that would be the case, but I'm not too sure, to be perfectly honest with you. But I just thought it was cool. I thought I'd mention it. And so with that, we might as well just come to the end of our episode of Weird Music today. I find it really delightful diving into the weird, wonderful world of Steep Gloss, who've pushed out this incredible array of collaborative albums from such a wide range of different musicians, all coming together in the name of experimentalism. And Waiting in the Waiting Room with a Waiter and a Waitress, is certainly an unusual album, no doubt about it. But there's a delight to the bafflement and the confusion that this album just makes us feel, as well as the sheer expression of the experimental notions and the combinations of such unusual sounds that end up transporting us to such peculiar and unusual worlds. Definitely a favourite of mine from this label, and I'm really glad to have this on a physical copy as well. It's very cool. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I've in the description below, I've put a whole host of links, to different albums, to the very album we've looked at, to Ben Presto and Angela Sawyer's own solo projects, and to Steep Gloss, so feel free to check it all out, have fun exploring weird experimental music, right? And with that, I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye!